Hi again, everybody. Welcome into another edition. This is Cross Functionality, the show connecting coaching, baseball, softball, male, female, hosted by former college baseball and softball players. Thank you for joining us today. However, you may be listening, Apple, Google, Spotify, whatever platform, and watching on YouTube, the Softball Strength Academy YouTube page. If you haven't done so already, go back and watch previous archived episodes and clips and subscribe on all of those platforms, audio and visual. All right, episode 49 today, we're talking switching gears, adapting coaching for younger athletes and adapting that coaching throughout different age groups as well. Not just younger athletes, but as the athlete matures and progresses throughout their athletic career. We've got a lot to talk about, so let me bring in my friend, co-host, softball national champion at the University of Alabama, and current day renowned coach, Cassie Reilly-Boccia.
Thank you. Yeah, all is good. Excited to talk about this one, especially because as a coach, when I first went into it, I remember thinking, you know what, I like the high school age athlete. I'll probably just work with the high school age athlete. But in the private sector, you start to realize you don't always have that choice, and it's not always what you thought you wanted. So to be able to adapt, I think, is huge.
You know, we talked about it last week, didn't we, towards the end of the show, about how hard it is, the coaching profession in general, to get a full-time position, and what you did, taking that leap of faith, right, and starting your own academy. And that's something right there you can't really kind of zero in on one age group. You have to be able to be as adaptable as a coach as much as you want your athletes to be adaptable as well. And you've coached all varieties, right? Middle school, high school, professional. Henry Davis comes to mind. Am I right? By the way, he moved. I saw the Pirates moved him to the outfield.
Yes, he's been playing right field, I believe.
Yeah. I always saw him more as a first baseman, but what do I know?
Yeah, I mean, he was an athlete through and through. I don't know. Like I said, we haven't worked with him since he was younger, but I don't know. I could see him. He probably just wants to win knowing him. So he'll probably just go anywhere he feels like he's needed.
Yeah. Well, we're talking today, again, switching gears, adapting coaching for different age groups. And I think for context purposes, listening to this show, watching this show, look up the LTAD model. Google it. It's out there, right, on Google, and you use that model as well, Cass. And there's 7 factors here that go along with the LTAD model. We'll talk about them all today very briefly. We'll touch on them. But active start, fundamentals, learning to train, train to train, train to compete, train to win, and then active for life. I think that last one fits us both well, right, in our 30s, at training, being able to train for life and being active. But if there's anything, you and I were talking about this off air, if there's anything that goes along with today's episode and being able to switch gears and coaches being able to adapt to different age groups of the guys and gals that they may be coaching, baseball and softball, it has a lot to do with the mental side as much as the physical side as well, and being able to get into that athlete's mental psyche, so then you can get the most out of them physically, no matter what age that might be.
Sure. And so with this long-term athletic development model, that this is kind of what the United States has developed. Canada has done one almost for sport specific. So, as you go online, you start to deep dive this. If you're a coach or if you're a parent and your athlete is just starting to progress, what you'll start to notice is these models will put general ranges for age groups. And that's certainly a question a lot of parents will ask, or a coach will ask, like, well, how do you train a 10-year-old? How do you train a 12-year-old? How would you train a 14-year-old, right? And so many times we have to look and say, okay, well, physically, have they matured to be 14? Or are they more like 15? Or are they still more like 12 or 13? And then mentally, what's their maturation level at? Because anybody who's been around, adults even too, you're going to have some people with a maturity that's able to handle something very different than someone else. And you have 2 athletes that are the exact same age. So you really do want to try to have these considerations just roaming in the back of your head as you're starting to get to know this athlete, so that you can say, okay, they really seem like they need more of this. They might need more of that. And you really want to just meet that athlete where they are. And then that's how you're going to get the most out of that training environment for sure.
Yeah. And you talk about active start, and that's really when the athlete is 8, 9, 10 years old. And Jake Epstein always says this too on the Lab Epstein Hitting podcast. He's talked about this on the podcast, but he's talked about this to me as well. There's a certain age, 5, 6, even 7 years old, where you just can't really teach what he teaches hitting. I'm sure you feel the same way with some of the high-level mechanics that you teach as well. It's hard to teach a 5, 6, 7-year-old coming into their own as it pertains to their swing, teach them those type of mechanics, because you might ruin them and you might be doing something that really feels unnatural to them. I wonder if this applies to just athletes in general, baseball and softball, when it comes to the active start portion of things. You don't want to do too much with them when they're 6, 7, 8, even 8 years old, playing at the T-ball level, but 9, 10, maybe 11 years old, the active start phase, that's when you can really begin to work that athlete both physically and mentally and kind of set that foundation for them in their future years.
Sure. And I think, with the explosion of the professional little leaguer that has come about, parents are really wanting to take things very seriously very soon, and almost as if they're going to be left behind if they don't. And I think what they sometimes forget, and what this model really suggests, is that there are certain stages that need to be hit, and there's certain boxes you need to check as the athlete is developing. And the ability to just have fun, and the ability to learn the sport in a fun way instead of an instructional or training-esque way is vital. And if you miss that, then all of a sudden you're not going to be able to hit on any of these other. It's not like you're going to get a head start. You're going to miss out on the ability to actually maximize anything that happens later on. So yes, and it's not to say that just because my coaching style hasn't adapted to or isn't as conducive for younger athletes, it doesn't mean that they don't need some type of activity or some type of training. If you ever go to a Little League game for any sport and you see there are professionals that can coach that age group, and I feel like parents will look down upon them because they're like, oh, they're just having fun. They're just bringing energy. Yeah. And there's a certain way to do it, and there's a science to it, and there's an importance to it, and I hope people don't look down on those types of coaches, because they are certainly vital for that athlete to progress to the next level of their sport.
When you're in the active part, the active phase, and we're just we'll say ages 9, between 9 and 12,
you have that all coming out of toddler stage, and then you have the fundamentals where fun is capitalized, right? So that it's okay, they're starting to learn maybe their sport in a little more structured way, let's say, but they're still fun is the paramount.
Okay, so when you're in the active start and the fun dimensions phase, what kind of drills, what kind of thing? And I don't like to use that word drills at such a young age, because I think it sets this negative connotation that we're just drills. And when you do too many drills, and we've talked about this before, especially on the hitting side, you're not going to get anything out of it and becomes counterproductive. But what kind of drills, what kind of elements are you working on with those kids at that age, that between 9 and 12, the active start and the fundamentals, that are helping, again, set that foundation for now their teenage years?
Sure. I think it's a lot of times, those younger levels, it's how can we be very athletic? And I think what's tough and what we see in a sport like baseball, softball, that is such a skill-based sport, is you start to lose some athleticism and sacrifice that for the skill, right? So I've argued forever that I feel like dodgeball should be played alternating innings in Little League, because kids get bored. They're focused so much on the skill piece, and there's not a lot of moving around. It's very stagnant. So how can we still teach them the sport and still keep it where they're constantly being active? Because if you ever hung out with kids under the age of 8, no, they don't want to sit still at all. And so to put them in a sport, it's almost like teaching them chess. It's like, nope, stay still, stay at this position only if a ball is hit to you. And then once it's hit to you, that's tough to do. So anyway, that the activity part of it, the athleticism part of it is huge. You're starting to introduce, hey, playing in a game can be fun, and learning the sport can be fun. And it doesn't have to necessarily just be a clinic style or a training setting style, where that is, as you can still teach them to have a kill switch and compete. But you want them to make sure that they're not miserable playing their sport.
So what you're saying is that when I was 8 years old and I was in the car with my dad on the way home from a T-ball or whatever, I don't think it was T-ball, and he asked me why I play sports or the game, this was baseball at the time, and I said, I play for fun, and he told me, no, you play to win, and lectured me for the next 30 minutes on the way home, and then into the house about when you go out there, you try to win. Is that a good or bad idea for parents to do when their kids are 8, 9, 10, 11 years old? Listen, I'm for Halo. Let's go.
Yeah. Listen, and as much as there's a I guess there's like this structure, right? These guidelines. It doesn't mean that like just when you get to age 14, you're allowed to start to introduce competitive nature and winning. That's no way. You're going to start to introduce it in some ways before, but winning is fun. And that should be like a lot of kids don't have the mental capacity to do things they don't enjoy just for the sake of winning. And so if you have a kid or an athlete who is not able to struggle through, well, I'm going to work on my weaknesses just to win, that's you're gonna probably deter them for their sport. Like, of course, most kids love to win. They love to hit. They love to. I saw a poll the other day someone put out, and they said, "Why do kids drop out of baseball?" And it was, "Is it boring? They can't field. They can't hit." And the two biggest answers were, "It's boring and they can't hit." And someone's like, "Well, if we fix hitting, it'll fix the boring part, right?" So you win, you're gonna have fun.
You have success, you're going to have fun too.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, I think there's a balance. You certainly want to start to ingrain like some of the competitiveness, because I think that's important. And that's part of just starting to look at yourself and maybe start to hold yourself to a little higher standard. But I don't think it needs to be the paramount focus of a younger athlete's sport environment.
Right. And there's a lot of other things that go into just going out there trying to win and compete every single time. And you want to obviously do that. And I'm all for that. I'm very competitive. I like going out there trying to compete and trying to win everything that I do. But when you're an athlete in organized sport like a baseball and softball, there's more to it. And this brings us to our next point, learning to train, understanding what you have to do off the field, whether it's in the weight room, understanding what you're doing at the plate and your hitting routine in general, in the batting cage, knowing what works for you. And those are things you have to, as an athlete, sort of start to come into your own and learn about when you're between the ages, I think, of 13 and 16 years old. So you can continue to set that foundation.
Sure. And I think the idea of training is, okay, I'm going to maximize what I'm good at, but I'm going to work on my weaknesses too. And something I've mentioned before, and I joke about it, it's even as adults, we don't like to work on our weaknesses, because as adults, we go to the gym, we usually pick out our own workouts. We're going to probably avoid the things we don't like to do. We don't like to do cardio, we're probably going to avoid it. We don't like to do pull-ups, it's probably going to not show up as much. It is difficult to show up to your weaknesses and to make a commitment to working on them. And I think, again, that's a certain level of mental fortitude, that's a certain level of focus, and it takes a lot. It takes a lot to have to go to a training session and say, okay, this might not be that enjoyable right now, but I'm doing this for something I want in the future. So again, that delayed gratification, it's so important to teach a kid. It's so important to introduce probably before 13, but not to make it the main. You don't want an 8-year-old going to batting cage only working on the low and outside pitch that they can't hit for an hour straight, because we don't know if that 8-year-old has the mental fortitude again to handle struggling on something like that for an hour straight. And at that point, you're probably doing more bad than good in helping the young athlete out.
When did you come to your, for lack of a better term, epiphany about understanding what you need to do training wise? What age, when it came to the weight room, when it came to your offense in the batting cage, when it came to doing the little things, working on your fielding, but doing little things in the batting cage, and little things that you have to do as an athlete, whether that's weightlifting, nutrition, when did all that come to fruition for you? When you were in high school, when you were trying to get to where you wanted to go, which was Division I college softball, accomplish that goal, what age did you start to realize I need to do all of these things, and I need to be cognizant of all these little things like nutrition, like strength training, and the little things I do in the batting cage that's going to help me get better?
Yeah, I would honestly say I was probably a little bit late to the party, only because I really started rec ball so late. I started closer to when I was 9 or 10. I didn't play as much when I was younger, which is fine. But it was kind of like, okay, I'm doing this for fun. And then it was like, oh, I really enjoy this. I'm good at this. And then, that 13-year-old age hit right before high school, that 8th grade into 9th grade year. And, I got exposed to it a little bit, where I was like, whoa, like some of these pitchers are better than me, and I think that's when it clicked, where I was like, I don't ever want to feel that unprepared for a pitcher again. And then I've talked about it at length too in previous podcasts. When I made the switch to the national level of playing when I was in high school, I got very exposed to how far behind I was, not necessarily for my age, but for where I wanted to be. I was not competing against these higher level pitchers. I was not competing when the speed of the game was so much faster. So I think that's when it started to click, like, okay, what can I control here? I can work my butt off as much as possible. I can try to eradicate every weakness. And that became not necessarily a game within itself, but kind of my own form of training was my own form of competition, I guess, was to just try to say, okay, we're gonna work really hard at this and let's see what happens.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you hear coaches say you shouldn't lift weights before this certain age or before this, you shouldn't be doing this type of exercise in the gym before this age, whether it be 14, 15 years old. I'm not sure I agree or disagree. I don't know. I think this is where, this is where I'm not a coach and you are, right? And you understand having to adapt, which is, again, today's episode main topic, adapting to that athlete.
Yeah.
Understanding what they can and can do, what their strengths are.
So there was a study, I don't even know what year it was from, that talked about kids lifting before a certain age was going to stunt their growth, right? And that's been disproved over and over again, but that lives in people's heads where it's like, training, I don't want my kid lifting. And what I don't think people realize is how important laying the basic foundation is for getting them to a position that when they do have the right hormones elicited and they are ready for that training to happen, you needed to have laid a foundation leading up to it. And there, to slap an age, a lot of doctors like to say, oh, you shouldn't be doing this before or age whatever, because that is what the literature might say. But again, we've seen 13-year-olds physically mature enough to handle something that a 14 or 15-year-old might be able to handle. And we've seen 15-year-olds who are not physically mature enough to handle certain loads, certain weights. For any human being of any age, you do not want to overload their system. That will hurt them. So yes, if you take a 11 or 12-year-old and you give them too much weight to lift, you are going to hurt them in some way. But if you progress them in the correct way with a professional who knows what they're doing, there's absolutely no reason they can't be in some type of training environment with some type of progressive overload. A band is a form of weightlifting. Technically, that's
well, even body weight. Yeah, body weight stuff, right? Push-ups, and body weight squats.
There's
what about
so much to do? Yeah.
What about plyometrics between the ages of 11 and 13? I'm not too big on, I'm just throwing this out there and whatever, but I'm not big on athletes 11, 12 years old, 13, even 13 years old, beginning to do the bench press, right? Beginning to do power moves like that, like the squat. I think that the foundation needs to be set, and the way you could do that when you turn 14, 15, so you're prepared for the bench press, because that does it's very taxing on your central nervous system. I don't care what anybody says, bench press, squat, deadlift, shoulder press. I'm not even for a barbell shoulder press, quite frankly. I'd rather do a landmine press. But expertise aside here, push-ups, maybe even dumbbell squats or jump squats, plyometric exercises that help you prepare as an athlete for when you can start to lift weights and do those power moves. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, again, push-ups set a good foundation for the upper body. Different variations of push-ups, plyometrics, doing those jump squats, jump lunges, things like that, alternating split squat lunges, things like that. You can do body weight-wise that sets that foundation.
Sure. Like I said, there's so much to do there. It is interesting. So there is a period of time where an athlete is approaching what's called PHV. It's their peak height velocity. So it's besides when they are an infant, it's the time in their life that they are going to grow the fastest, right? And there are certain markers where you can start to tell someone is approaching that time. And what happens is all of a sudden we have an athlete that has very stretched muscles because their bones have grown to make them taller, and their muscles have kind of been a delayed catch up, right? So we have some like 12-year-old boys, 13, whatever it may be, with like really tight hamstrings, and they might not be able to get into certain movements like the squats or the lunges yet because their body feels so awkward to them because they've grown so fast. Those are times where it is really valuable to be doing those athletic-based movements like the jumps and the sprints, and because that is going to get the athlete aware of their body, their new body, really sooner. And then what research also says, which is so interesting, is we have certain windows of opportunity where we might not get faster and might not get stronger, but we can actually improve the potential for how fast and how strong and how powerful you can get later on in your life, right? So again, setting the foundation it's like taking a cup of water. It's like, hey, if I get you at 16, 17, I can only fill this cup. But if I get you at 11, 12, 13, I can potentially make your cup size bigger. And I think that is what we have to understand what training actually is. It's you might have a kid starting to train and we're not going to see that huge increase right away. They don't have hormones elicited to have them grow muscle right away, but we are setting the foundation for that cup size to be bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right. And then, of course, nutrition's all involved as well. I hope coaches are listening to this closely today, because this is a learning experience, I think, for coaches. Talking today, episode 49, switching gears, coaches being able to adapt to different types of athletes. Next week, episode 50, we'll be talking about importance of visualization training. Very, very important and oftentimes overlooked. We'll be talking about that next week. Be sure to subscribe, Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a review. We appreciate that too. Reach out to us, Softball Strength Academy YouTube page. Watch the show. You can leave comments and email us to jimbopodcast21@gmail.com. Okay, now we get to train, which is now you're sports specific, and now you're trying to get stronger. You're really implementing the progressive overload, but you're doing it with weightlifting, doing it with different exercises. Hopefully you're mixing in some plyometric exercises, and now you're starting to work in those power moves, bench press, deadlift, squat, and shoulder press. But also when it comes to sports specific, in this case baseball and softball, you're starting to train, understanding what you need to do in the batting cage and the little things that you need to do in the field to get better fielding wise, base running, footwork, whatever that may be. We had our fun, right, from ages 9 to 13, 9 to 12, and you're smiling because I know you're going to go through this with your two boys, but now here we go, 13, 14 years old. It's time to really train because we're ending middle school here, getting out of 8th grade, and we're progressing on to high school. And before you know it, those 4 years go very fast.
Yeah, and I think, again, if you've hit it the right way and the athlete has learned how to have fun and learned where enjoyment happens in their sport, there's no reason they can't still be enjoying what they're doing. We're not going to be doing the whole training session. It's not going to be games, I guess, or it's not going to be centered around games, right? So, and something that I think is so important to teach, especially as we get into the pure training environment, is we have to make sure at the youngest of ages, we are not holding an athlete's hand through every step of the way. I have so many girls and guys that come in and feel like they can't even go hit off a tee. It's like, well, I don't know what to do, and I wouldn't even know if I'm doing it wrong. I wouldn't even know if I'm doing it right. And so they have been so accustomed to someone having to watch what they're doing in order for them to justify if they're doing it correctly or not, that they feel handcuffed to work on things on their own. So being able to teach that intrinsic style of learning instead of just telling an athlete every step of the way, put your arm here, put your elbow here, put your hand here, do this with your legs, is just so immensely valuable, because now they're going to get to this train to train stage and feel like they have some ownership over it, and not that they're just being dragged along by a coach or dragged along by a parent. So as long as we've set that foundation, I think them taking ownership and control of this phase is immensely important.
You mentioned intrinsic?
Intrinsic versus
intrinsic.
Yes.
Okay. Let's expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So intrinsic learning style, I think we have a podcast on this, but the intrinsic learning style is the athlete is, maybe you're providing these little guardrails, let's say, and then you're watching the athlete figure it on their own. Can they self-regulate on their own? Whereas extrinsic is, no, you're doing this wrong. Make sure you do X, Y, and Z. And you're telling the athlete exactly what to do. Not that there's teaching, and then there's controlling how the athlete is thinking, essentially. And one of the best examples that I can give is, again, I'm going to always favor an example in hitting, but let's say you have an athlete who is rolling over. That's a very common thing. They take their top hand, they roll over right away. An extrinsic style would be a coach coming over and guiding the athlete through and saying, hey, your palm up has to really be like this, and we have to force the shoulder and the elbow here, and this is where we have to finish, and this is exactly how you have to do it. And then an intrinsic style would be, okay, listen, we're going to have a tee, right, that you're hitting off of, and we're going to put another one that you're going to target to try to hit. So instead of hitting the ball on the ground over and over again to the pull side, all I want you to try to do is hit this tee off of that one, and then you sit back and you watch. And you see, it's like, okay, is the athlete might, for the first couple, roll over. Then all of a sudden, they might start to figure it out. They might start to, just based off of, okay, I need to hit this ball to this ball, their body starts to self-regulate and starts to figure it out on their own. That is going to be such a more meaningful pathway that they have just created from their brain to their body connection than being told what to do. being told what to do, they might get it right one time. Having them figure it out on their own, all of a sudden their body is going to solidify and cement that so much more. And you might be standing there being like, how are you feeling? What are you trying to do to get it that way? Like you might be guiding them a little bit, but you are not telling them exactly what to do.
Right. Well, so I want to ask you, how do you as a coach, and advice that you would have here for coaches to recognize when that athlete is ready to take that next step, meaning going from learning to train to train to train, and then of course the next step, train to compete. How do you recognize that, or the maturity in the student you may have, baseball and softball? It doesn't matter if it's in the batting cage or not, but recognizing that, okay, they're ready for this type of coaching that they need from me, because sometimes there's that slippery slope there. You never know between the ages really of 11 and 14 if they are ready to go on to that next level. So in your expertise, how do you recognize that?
Sure. You know what? That's a great question, and I think it's going to vary a little bit for person to person. For me, especially with younger females, but definitely males too, I can usually tell by watching their anxiety and their, I guess, curiosity maybe. So when they're learning to train and we're going over some very small basics, and then when we go into that train, and I really try to push them, and maybe I expose them to some type of stimulus where I leave them on their own a little bit more, or they come into a group style setting instead of a smaller group setting. And I'm watching and I can see, okay, they can be uncomfortable, but are they uncomfortably curious about like how much better I can get? Or are they uncomfortably anxious where they are very intimidated by this next phase? And you start to say, okay, the curiosity one, I can start to push a little bit more. The anxiety one, who's starting to get filled with some anxiety, we'll address but maybe push a little slower, nurture that a little bit more. So I guess because you want them uncomfortable, right? You don't want them to just be in this constant state of comfort where they're not getting better. You want to continue to push them. I joke all the time when I get athletes, I'm like, I want to make you as uncomfortable as I can, but with you still getting better. And I think that is where you're starting to watch what's going on. And then even that competition level, there's a lot of athletes who are immensely confident in completing drills that they're comfortable with and that they've done over and over again. And then sometimes I'll stop the music and I'll stop something and be like, hey, she's doing this drill really, really well. And everyone watches and she's like, ooh, all of a sudden there's that anxiety, but that's good because I want to see, okay, how does she respond to it? Did it go well? Did it not? How was her response to that? And then how do we progress that even further? There are times when I know from an outsider's perspective, it doesn't look as efficient of a training environment where I have 5 girls hitting in a key and 1 girl's hitting at one time while everyone else is watching. And people are looking and they're like, you should set up some other stuff so people get more reps. And I'm like, no, there's a purpose to this. I want all eyes on one hitter right now. So I guess it's kind of like just like testing a little bit of this, watching how someone responds, testing a little bit of this. And again, you get to know the athlete and you're going to start to see how well they do with those next stages of development and where they might need more help.
So you're testing that athlete both physically but also neurologically as well, because you don't want them to, because they're doing the drill really well, and you might fear that maybe they go on or into autopilot.
Yeah, definitely. There's autopilot, but then there's also this like I don't want to say a false sense of, oh, I'm doing really well, but it's kind of like, okay, cool, like you're doing great. I don't want you to hit every ball in my cage really, really well. I want you to fail a few times, and let me train you through that failure. Because that's going to be way more valuable than you having just a perfect hitting session. That's not my goal. I want to then like add to the challenge more. I want to make the speed faster. I want to add movement. I want to just challenge you and then watch you fail a little bit and then see how you do. Again, there is that balance. I can't throw an athlete into a situation where they are so frustrated, so uncomfortable, so anxious, because they're not going to, yes, they just got exposed to a very uncomfortable environment, but they're not going to get anything out of it.
All right. So as we wrap up today's episode 49, talking about switching gears, coaches adapting to coaching different athletes from younger to older athletes. Do we have everything? Do we cover everything today as it pertains to coaches being as adaptable as possible?
I think so. I think just as I was starting to think about this today, I was like, you know what? I think the biggest mistake I made when I was younger and coming up as a coach is that I thought I had to overcomplicate things for a more mature, older athlete. And really simplicity wins so much of the time, whether it's a younger athlete or older athlete. Certainly your interpretations might be more complex because of your experience, but that doesn't mean you have to recite, the encyclopedia on hitting to an 18-year-old, because that's
Right.
it. It can still be simple even at the older ages. That's all. And honestly, probably some of the smartest coaches in the world have figured out a way to make really complex things seem really, really simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was my last point on adjustments to older and younger, something that I guess wins across the board.
Right. It's being able to make those adjustments as easy as possible, right? And
Yes.
making the language as simple as possible, too. Episode 50 next week, talking about the importance of visualization training. How much visualization training did you used to do?
Definitely more as I got older, because it is very, very hard to do. And when I was hard, I was like, this just doesn't work for me. And then I realized, I was like, wait a second. Too many people are talking about this for it not to matter.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm excited for that one, because it's certainly something that I just think it's not tangible. It's very, very difficult to measure and grasp, and but it can be your most important tool that you work on.
All right, very good. Well, great episode today, episode 49. Any questions, email us, dreambowpodcast21@gmail.com, and we will talk to you next week.